Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. This time, we're tackling something a listener wrote in about self-organizing teams. They're trying to make it work at their company, and they sent over this article that really got them thinking. And luckily for us, we've got, well, I'd say a bit of an expert here to help us unpack all of this. I'm excited to see what we discover.
Well, I'm excited to be here. Self-organizing teams. I think a lot of us hear that phrase, we throw it around, but are we all on the same page with what it means?
That's a good point. And what's funny is the Agile Manifesto, which is kind of where this whole idea came from, doesn't even really give us a clear definition of what a self-organizing team is.
It's true. It just says that the best architectures, requirements, and designs emerge from self-organizing teams. But then what does best mean? And what does it mean for a team to be self-organizing? I mean, it's kind of like, where do you even begin?
Okay, so let's try to unpack this a little. Your article brought up a few different definitions, right? From Forbes, the Scrum Alliance, and Mike Kuhn.
Right, so we've got Forbes talking about like decision-making authority, teams being able to make choices about their work processes and really taking ownership. Then you've got the Scrum Alliance, which is focused on teams pulling work from a backlog and managing it themselves, right? No more micromanaging. And then there's Mike Kuhn, who's, a big name in Agile, who's pointing out that, look, management is still providing the overall direction. It's not just a free-for-all, but the team gets to figure out how to get the work done.
Okay, so there seems to be a theme of autonomy, but autonomy to do what exactly? Like, where do those boundaries lie? I think that's what our listener is really grappling with.
Yeah, and I think that's like the biggest question. And it's important to remember that self-organization is not about giving teams the keys to the kingdom. They're not setting bonuses. They're not crafting the company strategy. They're not rewriting HR policies. It's about execution. It's about figuring out the best way to achieve goals that the organization has already set.
So not about deciding what work to do, but how to do it, which frankly is still a ton of responsibility. Now, your article also brought up some historical examples of worker-run ventures. Like, did any of those actually succeed?
Yeah, so it's interesting. You had German cooperatives, things happening in the U.S. timber and steel industries, even the Yugoslavian system where workers were supposed to manage everything. But, most of those examples kind of fell flat, and the only real success story that people point to is the Mondragon Cooperative in Spain, which was a very specific set of circumstances.
Right.
But it just goes to show you that, like, true worker self-management is really hard to pull off.
Okay, so full worker control might sound appealing in theory, but maybe not so much in practice. So back to self-organizing teams. If they're not running the whole show, what do they actually have control over? What are some concrete examples?
Okay, let's get into the nitty-gritty. So they might decide, hey, are we going to pair program? Are we going to mob program, choosing their programming method? Are they going to use test-driven development? How do they structure their work hours? What are their testing practices? How are they approaching continuous improvement? They have the freedom to optimize their workflow within the bigger picture of the organization's objectives.
Okay, so it's not just tossing out the company rule book, but can they make like stricter rules for themselves? Like, could they decide to have a stricter dress code than what the company requires?
Yeah, you're getting it. They can absolutely set tighter standards in the organization, but never looser ones. So yeah, like a stricter dress code or committing to test-driven development, even if the company just suggests it, it's all fair game. But they can't just be like, hey, let's ignore the anti-harassment policy or the safety protocols are just suggestions.
Okay, so raise the bar, but don't lower it. I got it. Now, I'm still a little fuzzy on the difference between like self-organization and self-management. Are those basically the same thing?
Ah, good question. And your article had a perfect example of how those two can get confused. There was this team, right? They were really good at self-organizing, but then they decided they were going to take it a step further and handle a colleague's performance issues themselves.
Oh boy. I bet that went well.
Well, they created an improvement plan. The colleague ended up leaving the company, and the team realized, whoa, we bit off a little more than we can chew. And this experience really taught them that self-organization is about how you work, whereas self-management, which includes things like personnel decisions, that's a whole other ballgame.
Wow, that's a big lesson learned. So it seems like pushing those boundaries, even if it gets messy, can actually be really valuable for teams to figure out how much autonomy they can really handle.
For sure. I think it's all about finding that sweet spot, enough freedom to make decisions and solve problems, but without, dumping a ton of responsibility on them that they're not ready for.
All right, so we've got self-organization, we've got self-management. Now your article throws in this other idea, self-assembly. So how does that fit into all of this?
So this comes from Joseph Pelrain, who sees these all as points on a spectrum. Self-assembly is like the most basic level. People come together for a while, but they don't necessarily build any lasting relationships or change how they do things.
Give me an example. I'm having trouble picturing this.
Okay, think of a crowded elevator. Everyone kind of naturally adjusts their position to make space, right? But there's no real connection. There's no lasting change in behavior. It's just like you self-assemble to fit in the elevator. And once you get off on your floor, it's back to business as usual.
Okay, that clicks. So it's clear why self-assembly isn't enough for true self-organization. So if our listeners' teams are just like sharing a workspace, but not really changing how they work or relate to each other, they might just be stuck at that self-assembly level.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is that Pellerin argues that a lot of teams, they never even get past that first stage to true self-organization. They might be pulling work, they might be sitting together, but they haven't made that jump to where they're constantly improving their processes. And it's a journey, not a destination.
So just putting people together doesn't make a self-organizing team. Self-organization is a spectrum. Not all teams get there. And most importantly, it's about how to work, not what work to do. This is a lot to absorb. It's really starting to make sense.
It's all starting to come together. So, just because a group of people occupies the same space doesn't mean they're a self-organizing team. And reaching that level of, self-sufficiency, it's a journey. It's not as easy as flipping a switch.
Right. And I think our listeners probably thinking, okay, I get the concept, but how do I actually make this happen with my teams? Like, where do you even begin?
Well, the first step is, figure out where your teams actually fall on that spectrum we talked about. Self-assembly, self-organization, or self-management. Are they just sharing a physical space? Or have they started taking ownership of their processes, figuring out how to continuously improve?
Yeah, how can our listener assess that? Like, are there any telltale signs to look for?
Well, think about how decisions get made. Are teams mostly waiting for instructions from above? Or are they proactively spotting problems and coming up with their own solutions?
So if a team is like constantly running to management for approval on every little thing, that's a pretty good indication they haven't embraced self-organization, right?
Yeah, it could be. But, it's also important to remember that empowering teams doesn't mean just throwing them into the deep end without any support.
Yeah.
There's that balance.
Yeah. So what role does leadership play in all of this, right? Because it seems kind of paradoxical. Like, how do you lead a team that's supposed to be self-leading?
Yeah, and that's a question that a lot of organizations, get tripped up on. The old command and control style, that just doesn't fly with self-organizing teams. Leaders need to shift from being directors to being enablers.
Okay, so instead of like barking out orders and setting rigid deadlines, it's more about creating that environment where teams can like flourish on their own terms?
Exactly. So that means, yeah, setting clear goals, expectations, but then it's about trusting the team to figure out the best path to get there. And of course, giving them the resources, the training, the support they need to be successful.
So trust is a huge factor here. You have to trust that the team has the knowledge and the motivation to get the job done, even if they don't do it exactly the way you would have.
Yeah, trust is absolutely like fundamental.
Yeah.
And it can be really tough for leaders who are used to calling all the shots.
Hmm.
But I mean, without that trust, it just won't work.
But what if a team makes a mistake? Does that mean like, oh, they weren't ready for self-organization?
Mistakes are going to happen. That's just part of life. And honestly, I think mistakes are some of the best learning opportunities, right? A big part of self-organization is that continuous improvement mindset. And that means learning from your successes, but also learning from your failures.
So instead of like punishing mistakes, it's more about encouraging teams to, dissect what went wrong and figure out how to do it differently next time.
Exactly. You want to create an environment where people feel safe taking risks, trying new things, knowing that they're not going to get penalized if things don't go perfectly.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense. But I can imagine that some leaders might be, pretty resistant to giving up that control.
Yeah.
So how do you convince them to embrace a more empowering leadership style?
It's a cultural shift. And like any big change, it's going to take time and effort. Training, coaching can be really helpful, helping leaders understand like why this is beneficial and developing the skills they need to actually support self-organizing teams. And then celebrating wins, showing how these teams are driving results.
So it's not just about changing individual mindsets. It's about creating a company culture where autonomy and ownership are truly valued.
Absolutely. It's like shifting from a culture of control to a culture of trust and collaboration.
This is all fantastic information, but let's get down to brass tacks here. How do you actually make this transition to a self-organizing model? It's one thing to, buy into the concept, but it's a whole other challenge to put it into practice.
Well, there are different approaches, right?
Yeah.
The best path really depends on the organization. Some people, they'll start with a pilot program, implement self-organization in like just one team or department, kind of dip their toes in the water, see how it works, identify any issues, and then, fine-tune their approach before rolling it out more widely.
That seems like a really smart way to do it. Start small, learn as you go, then gradually expand. But what about teams that are like used to a more traditional hierarchical structure? How do you help them adapt to this whole new way of working?
Yeah, well, that's where clear communication and training come in. Teams need to understand what self-organization means for their day-to-day work, right? Like, what are their new responsibilities? How do they collaborate? How do they make decisions without constantly needing permission?
So it's not just about giving them autonomy, it's about giving them the tools and skills they need to use that autonomy effectively.
Exactly. So they might need training in like communication, conflict resolution, decision-making processes, maybe even specific agile methodologies like Scrum or Kanban. Those frameworks are designed to support self-organizing teams.
So there are a lot of moving parts involved in making this transition work. Are there any common pitfalls that organizations should be aware of?
One of the biggest ones is, assuming that you can just slap a label on a team and call them self-organizing and expect magic to happen. It's a process, right? It requires continuous support, coaching, adjustments along the way.
So it's not like a one-time switch, it's a journey of learning and adaptation.
Right. And then another mistake is underestimating the importance of leadership. As we talked about, leaders play such a crucial role in enabling self-organization. So they need to provide clarity, support, resources, and cultivate that culture that values autonomy and trust.
It's like walking a tightrope. You have to provide guidance without micromanaging, set boundaries without stifling creativity. Are there any other traps to watch out for?
Well, one word that comes to mind is forgetting about the human element. Self-organization relies on strong interpersonal skills, good communication, and the ability to, resolve conflict in a healthy way.
So it's not just about processes and structures, it's about fostering that positive team dynamic
Right.
where people feel comfortable sharing ideas, challenging each other, and working together effectively.
Exactly. And that brings us to another essential ingredient, which is psychological safety. Team members need to feel safe to speak up, share their perspectives, even admit when they've made a mistake. Without that sense of safety, true collaboration and innovation just won't happen.
Okay. This has been incredibly helpful for our listener, I think, as they start down this path of, implementing self-organizing teams. But before we wrap up our deep dive, I want to shift gears for a moment and talk about the individual.
Oh, that's a great point. We've been talking a lot about teams, but you can't forget that, self-organization also requires a certain mindset and skill set from each individual team member.
Right. So what does it take to thrive in a self-organizing environment? What qualities should individuals cultivate to make this work?
Well, a few things come to mind. First, I think you need a strong sense of ownership and accountability. Members of self-organizing teams, they need to be proactive, take initiative, feel responsible for the team's success. It can't just be a matter of sitting back and waiting to be told what to do.
Makes sense. It's about being a contributor, not just a passenger. What else?
Excellent communication skills are crucial, obviously.
Yeah.
Being able to express your ideas clearly, listen to others, and have productive conversations, especially when there are disagreements.
Right. So it's not enough to just be a good talker. You got to be a good listener and a good collaborator.
Exactly. And, that ties into another important quality, which is the ability to embrace feedback and learn from mistakes. Self-organizing teams, they're all about experimenting, adapting. So that means being open to constructive criticism and willing to, change course when necessary.
Okay, this is all great advice for our listener, but before we wrap up our deep dive today, I want to leave them with one final thought-provoking question.
Ooh, I always love a good challenge. What have you got?
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the journey towards self-organization, but what happens if a team actually reaches that point? Can they ever go back? Can a truly self-organizing team successfully revert to a more traditional structure?
That's a fascinating question. And it's definitely one worth exploring. Raises all sorts of intriguing possibilities.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the world of self-organizing teams.
We've really covered a lot of ground, haven't we? From those slippery definitions to the real-world examples.
Yeah. And we even talked about those essential qualities that individuals need to make self-organization really click.
Right. And we left our listener with that big question, that cliffhanger.
Yeah.
Can a team that's reached true self-organization ever go back?
Exactly. We just kind of left that hanging in the air.
It really gets to the heart of, you know, autonomy and adaptability and even just organizational culture. What happens when a team has tasted freedom and then you ask them to give it back?
Okay, so let's paint a picture for our listener.
Okay, so imagine a team that's fully embraced self-organization,
Right.
right? They're making their own decisions, setting their own pace, constantly fine-tuning their processes. They become this, well-oiled machine.
They've reached that ideal state, that holy grail.
Exactly. But then something happens. Maybe there's a new CEO, a new strategy, some kind of market shift. And the organization decides to go back to a more traditional top-down hierarchy.
They're basically saying to this high-performing team, okay, put the genie back in the bottle.
Right. And that brings up so many questions. First, can it even be done? Can a team that's gotten used to calling the shots easily switch back to taking orders?
Yeah, it almost seems like, trying to unlearn a skill.
Right. And then there's the whole psychological impact. How would that affect morale, motivation, even productivity?
I'd imagine there would be a lot of disappointment, maybe some frustration, even resentment. They've experienced the benefits and now they're gone.
Totally. You might see disengagement, resistance. People might even decide to leave.
So what's the takeaway here for our listener? Should they be worried about this potential downside?
I think the main thing is to just be aware of the implications. Go into it with eyes wide open. If an organization is considering self-organizing teams, they need to be all in, committed to the concept.
It's not something you just try on for size. It's a real commitment.
Right. And it's so important to have those open and honest conversations with the teams, explain the why, address any concerns.
Transparency, communication, key ingredients.
Always. And remember, even if a team does transition back to a more traditional structure, that experience of self-organization, it will leave its mark. They'll have gained valuable skills: communication, collaboration, problem-solving, self-management.
So it's not a wasted effort?
Nope, it's an investment.
Well, this has been such an insightful journey. We've explored so many different angles. The theoretical, the practical, the historical.
And hopefully given our listener a lot to think about.
Absolutely. We hope this deep dive has helped you understand this complex but super interesting topic. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.